Good evening and welcome to the Hauenstein Center's program. It's my assignment and pleasure to be able to introduce Gleaves Whitney to you. And I think you probably all know Gleaves. Gleaves is the director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley. Since he became the director in 2003, the Hauenstein Center has had remarkable growth and achieved what I view to be an extraordinary number of achievements. I also believe, and have tried to repeatedly voice, that there are too few people in our community who understand and appreciate the depth and breadth of the Hauenstein Center. Ralph Hauenstein was a top leader in 20th century America. From being Eisenhower's intelligence leader in Europe, through business as a very successful entrepreneur, and then on into the philanthropic world. Ralph Hauenstein's vision and contributions are seen all through Western Michigan. Some with his name, but many of them without. Gleaves became the director in 2003 and has been the responsible architect of more than 350 public programs, 4 national conferences, and 4 international webcast debates. And when I talk about the national conferences, these aren't conferences where you get a few politicians together and you talk about the issues. These are academic, principally based discussions. For instance, you may remember that the Bush presidency created all kinds of questions in America about religion and the presidency. Gleaves and the Hauenstein Center brought in first-rate scholars from all across the country for 2.5 days to discuss the history of and the impact of and the meaning of religion and the presidency. That's the sort of thing that have been done right here at Grand Valley State University and by the Hauenstein Center. And as I said, the architect has been Gleaves Whitney. The Hauenstein Center is dedicated to raising a community of ethical and effective leaders for the 21st century. It seeks to provide a platform for emerging leaders in all of the major aspects of public life: business, government, and nonprofit. The center promotes civic engagement that honors the founder, Ralph Hauenstein's vision of a constitutional republic that builds on existing institutions, that in its mission statement state that the existing institutions, it builds justice and freedom and opportunity, sustainable prosperity, and the rule of law. And the Hauenstein Center envisions the possibilities of creating better communities. To do these things, they host the world-class debates, which I've mentioned. They have the Wheelhouse Talks, which you may or may not be familiar with, but which feature cross-disciplinary local leaders who share their philosophy and experience in teaching and training the community. And they operate the Cook Leadership Academy, which works with emerging leaders to help them strive to be more ethical, more effective, and in constant engagement with professionals. All of the above that I've recited is visible. And while it's my judgment that it's visible, it's never been well enough recognized in the community for its goals and achievements, but what really has not been recognized, and which I'm trying to do here tonight, is the extraordinary ability and background and ability of your speaker, Gleaves Whitney. I think his light has been under a bushel. Just let me tell you a little bit about his background. And it's a perfect background for running an academic, public affairs, historical institution which he's running. He was raised in Texas and then went to Colorado State University, where he graduated with a BA in history and geography. He got his master's degree in history from the University of Michigan. He's a candidate for a PhD in history at the University of Michigan. He's been an adjunct professor at Grand Valley and Aquinas colleges. He's been a visiting professor and instructor at the University of Michigan and at Colorado State University, at the Russell Kirk Center, at the Center for the American Idea, which is in Saginaw Valley. He's done these things in addition to building and running the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. Gleaves was the senior writer and chief speechwriter and historian for Michigan's Governor John Engler from 1992 to 2003. That's what I'm talking about, the mix of the practical and the real world and the historical and the academic world. Prior to that, he did research for the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. It's with great pleasure that I introduce a man who I think has extraordinary vision and has done remarkable things for this university and for this center, Gleaves Whitney. Thank you.
Hillary, you really outdid yourself there. You turned me red. My fair skin was blushing a number of times during that introduction. And I want to thank you so much for all that you have done to contribute to the success of the Hauenstein Center, because what he did not tell you is all of the work that he's been doing as the head of our advisory cabinet. And we have a fine advisory cabinet, and Hillary has exercised great leadership there, and he's been really one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the idea of common ground. In fact, there are a number of people in this room that I'm going to get to have the honor really to mention here who've been enthusiastic about common ground. I do want to say at the very beginning, though, thank you, Ralph Hauenstein, at 101 years old, for being here and being so supportive. Thank you, sir. Is common ground even possible? Now, I knew this would be a tough crowd when I was walking through those doors back there, and this one woman came up to me and said, well, when I looked at your question, I just thought, good luck. And, because I do get into the classroom quite a bit, I tend to take surveys of the students. So if you will indulge me, let's have a little survey right now. How many of you think that significant common ground is possible in our country today? Be bold, hands high. Maybe about 20 of you. Okay, this auditorium seats 235, so fewer than 1 out of 10. How many of you think, and I'm actually half serious when I ask this, how many of you think that common ground can occur if more Republicans and Democrats would go out and have a good sip and scotch at the end of the day? There you go. That's right. That's exactly right. That's what happens in our system. This is the way it was done in the past. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, before the actual talk. So this talk is part of our Constitution Day celebration at Grand Valley State University. And at the Hauenstein Center, we are proud to host this on behalf of Grand Valley. We're doing it about a week before the actual day, September 17th, but I want everybody to realize that the Constitution is behind much of this talk. And in fact, I want to start with a little story, because this story helps frame really what we're about this evening. The story goes, and there's good evidence that it really occurred, and this is not just apocryphal, but there's a story that says on the last day of the Constitutional Convention, so we're talking September 17th, 1787, right there in Philadelphia, there at the Philadelphia State House. On the last day, the delegates were leaving, and there was a woman who had posted herself outside the doors of the convention. And when she saw Dr. Benjamin Franklin, she said, I've been just dying to ask you this question. What have you given us, Dr. Franklin, a republic or a monarchy? And Franklin said, a republic if you can keep it. If you can keep it. If we can keep it. That is really the story through the ages, generation in and generation out, if we can keep the republic. And I'm going to argue that one of the chief ways that we Americans have sustained our republic in the past, and we're going to keep it going now, despite all the pessimism and cynicism. We all know it's all out there. But one of the chief ways that we're going to keep it all going is precisely through a renewed interest in, keen pursuit of common ground, principled compromise, and the ways of getting to that common ground, which I'm going to explain a little bit later. Now, I'm going to argue that this pursuit of common ground is perfectly consistent with what our founders intended. I think the founders are used nowadays in ways that kind of abuse really who the founders were. I think it gets abused on the left and the right, so I'm going to try to correct the record just a little bit with regard to the founders. And speaking of the founders, we should take pains to see how partisan they could be. It's really quite remarkable when you think about them. But George Washington broke his heart that already factions were forming when he was trying to help establish this nation. He bemoaned the fact that you had Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and then the Federalists were up against the Democratic Republicans, and on and on. And he said in that marvelous farewell address of his, beware of these factions. But he knew, he was realist enough to know that the factions there would be. So sometimes, in fact, they couldn't even agree over the most fundamental things. Arguably, the most humorous moment at the Constitutional Convention occurred when tensions were running very high. They were debating, and Franklin, ever the man of prudence, very practical about these things, he said, you know what, why don't we cool things off a little bit? Why don't we pray? To which Alexander Hamilton snapped, Dr. Franklin, this is no time to invoke foreign aid. Okay, why common ground in the Hauenstein Center, and why now? Well, certainly the idea for common ground has been a long time in the making, I think, and for those of us, Hillary and Ralph, and we see the leadership at the university there, President Haas, Provost Gail Davis, and Fred Anzac, a number of people. I think there have been so many good conversations we've had over the past 10 years about what could a Presidential Studies Center do? A Presidential Studies Center, you see, is perfectly positioned because the President of the United States is President of all the people. A president cannot for long, decide, well, I'm going to be just a president for the D's or just a president for the R's. He's got to deal with the fact that he's president of all 230 million Americans. So a Presidential Studies Center is perfectly positioned. Here at Grand Valley, we're perfectly positioned to pursue this. We've got our friends at the Ford Museum and the Ford Foundation across the street. Grand Valley, not just the Hauenstein Center, but Provost Davis's office, great relations with the Ford Foundation, working with Steve Ford and others. So we are well positioned to pursue this topic, and the people in this room who've been supportive have been just marvelous, and that's why this is not just a go-alone Hauenstein Center program by any means. We, of course, have tried very hard as a Presidential Studies Center to demonstrate common ground in our programming. We've hosted a number of debates, and we've had some pretty spicy debates over the years, as you know. I think the most famous, many of you know this, is Hitchens v. Hitchens, where we had Christopher and Peter come in. Literally a debate, clips of which appeared on 60 Minutes about a year and a half ago during Christopher's demise when 60 Minutes featured him. We've had Arianna Huffington and Victor Davis Hanson. We've had Katrina Vanden Heuvel and Rich Lowry, and a number of other people come together and debate, and always with civility. That was even after Christopher Hitchenson's, by the way, he had 4 Johnny Walker Blacks before he debated, but he stayed civil. We also have gotten a great imprimatur from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Very proud that this university and through the Hauenstein Center, we've been able to pull in a National Endowment for the Humanities grant that allowed us to have 2 Common Ground programs last year. They were hard-hitting, tough, right here on this stage. In fact, April 15th, Tax Day, we had 3 conservatives on that side of the stage, to your right, 3 progressives on this side of the stage, your left, and we had a very frank exploration of first principles in each camp. What is the extent to which people from those 2 traditions can, with goodwill, meet and discover common ground? Very, very exciting. We got a lot of feedback from that. Then there are just to let you know where this evening comes from, the conversations here at the university. Don Lubbers. Don, are you here? Is Don Lubbers here? Okay. Don Lubbers and I had a pivotal conversation in April 2012 when he said, you know, I was just up at the Russell Kirk Center. I was just talking to Annette Kirk. And he said, I think the time has come for conservatives to be serious and real about redefining their tradition, in the same way that Russell Kirk in 1953 challenged conservatives in that day to recognize their tradition and redefine it in terms of the crises of that time. Don said, you know, I think we could be in a renewal at this point. And of course, with the conservative mind coming up on its 60th birthday, I think he had a point. And he quoted to me in our phone conversation about this. He said, to review conservative ideas, examining their validity for this perplexed age is the purpose of such an undertaking. Words written in 1953 by Russell Kirk, but that apply today. And then I started talking to my progressive friends on campus. Yeah, I have progressive friends on campus. And they also were very attentive to the need for a conservative, progressive dialogue on campus, and proud and excited by the opportunity that Grand Valley had, because we did a little bit of research, and I'm going to tell you about that in just a moment. But the gathering snowball here with Don Lubbers and Annette Kirk and Noreen Myers on our Board of Trustees, who, as a progressive and one of the founders of the Progressive Women's Alliance, totally embraced us and has been going abroad to talk about this project and looking at the capacity of progressives to redefine their tradition for the 21st century and to engage in civil discourse at this time. And then, as I say, Tom Haas, Gail Davis, Karen Loth, Mary Beth Wardrop, Fred Anzac, so many people in this room, Hillary, of course, and Ralph. So many people in this room have said, green light, go for it. This is the time, this is the place to get moving on this. And then we started getting support from foundations. The NEH I've mentioned, the Meyer Foundation has been very supportive. Dyer Ives Foundation here in town has been very supportive. And I'm asked, what does Ralph Hauenstein really think? Well, Ralph and I always have a cup of coffee on Saturday morning. No doubt that he would be interested in what we were going to talk about today. So Ralph and I are sitting there, and about the 30-minute mark, he looks at his watch and he says, you know what, I'm not letting you go home until I ask you about this common ground business. He said, you know, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about it. And he put me through the paces. I mean, Ralph wanted to know that we are thinking through every angle that we can as we unroll this very exciting initiative. And of course, when people ask me, what does Ralph think of common ground, I always like to point out, here's the guy who was part of the greatest common ground effort in human history. Think about it. The Allied effort in World War II to overcome the Wehrmacht and the Germans' fortress Europe. Here's a guy who saw the 20 countries that were part of the Allied alliance and that would go on to form the United Nations, and then drill down specifically and look at Ralph's work and his colleagues' work to pull D-Day off, and to think of all of the resources and all of the tension. You had to resolve a lot of tension to get the French to cooperate with the British, to get the Russian cooperation, so many other, the Canadians and the Americans. The largest amphibious invasion in world history, executed by land, sea, and air elements, coordinating more than 160,000 soldiers on that day, June 6th, and about the same number of naval and merchant navy personnel in more than 5,000 ships. and many hundreds of thousands of civilians providing critical logistical and background support from 2 continents. This is common ground. Despite all of the challenges, this was an attempt to do something that transcended nation and tribe and faction. Now, of course, Ralph will also tell you, get him to tell you this, he'll tell you how he became a world-renowned consensus builder himself after World War II when he launched his business career. He worked tirelessly, he told me, to find common ground in the Swiss roll when he brought together cream filling and chocolate cake. You know, we've done a little research about what are the other organizations out there. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And I was prepared to say, okay, after we do research, we set a team of people on this. After we do a little research, we may find that somebody's beat us to the draw. Everybody's talking about common ground. Everybody says we need it. And there's some great organizations, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the only think tank in Washington, D.C. that's devoted to trying to find common ground. No Labels. The Kettering Foundation has a National Issues Forum. And there's even an organization called the Search for Common Ground, which came out of the Cold War and seeks peace. And then on campuses, John Wardrop's going to love to hear this, but the Dartmouth Centers Forum is a very important Ivy League initiative. Michigan State University, for you Spartans here, should be very proud of the political leadership program run by my buddy Doug Roberts. Excellent program for training people to be prepared for careers in state government, taking in 12 men, 12 women, 12 R's and 12 D's in every class. So Doug's doing a great job there. We know many universities have excellent programs in civil discourse. These are great initiatives, all. But Grand Valley State University has an opportunity because no university is doing what we're trying to do here now. What are we trying to do? We're trying to invite progressives and conservatives, as we've done in the past, to a forum. We're inviting them to redefine their tradition, and we're hoping that to the extent that they redefine their tradition with each other, that they will, in goodwill, seek out some of the historical and cultural precedents and roots of common ground. We're going to be very specific about this in just a few minutes. Now, we also have a practical streak in us. I don't want this to be a purely academic exercise. One of the reasons we went after the Dyer Ives Foundation grant, in fact, was precisely to take the academic research, to take the techniques, for example, of the Harvard Negotiation Project and go out into the community and actually help diverse groups in the community be better neighbors with each other and see common ground that they can achieve. You know, I think there's a lot of consensus around improving our neighborhoods, increasing access to health care, fixing potholes. These do not have to be issues that are alienating, but sometimes after watching cable TV, they become so. Okay, I want to just mention as well, as a final part of this part of my talk, that the Hauenstein Center has been committed to trying to launch a series of talks this year that bring in exciting speakers who can talk about common ground. You're going to see Jonathan Haidt in October, for example. We're going to do this in partnership with the Business Ethics Center. He's done more work than anybody else on the evolutionary psychology of why we reason morally the way we do and the challenges to common ground for when Republicans and progressives get together. We're going to bring in Senator Olympia Snowe, who recently retired and wrote a book, Fighting for Common Ground. We're going to bring in Colin Woodard. I just had an exchange with our provost about Colin Woodard's work on the 11 American nations. You know, what is the tribalism that's still in America, and how do you overcome fundamentally opposed tribes in America who come with their ethnic background? Deborah Mower is somebody that we're going to bring in partnership with the philosophy department. She's done great work on civil discourse, and it's more than good manners. Of course we cherish good manners, but we're talking about more than that. We're talking about the actual techniques of listening and empathizing and seeing where people are coming from before we judge too quickly. In April, we look forward to a partnership with the Russell Kirk Center and other organizations in West Michigan to bring conservatives and progressives together on this stage and see where we can get common ground around an exciting topic to go. And we're going to be out there, in addition to these talks, in our American Conversation series, which is what that banner represents on the far right. We're also going to be training the trainers, getting out there in the community and helping people, where we bring the Harvard negotiation project techniques right here to West Michigan and help people resolve their differences in an amicable way, and that leaves the community stronger as a result. Now, I know there are a lot of skeptics out there. You all know me as a pretty optimistic guy, and I've gotten plenty of comments. Gleaves, you're over the top this time. You're way too optimistic. What do you think that the chances of this really succeeding are? Well, I know if we don't try, we have a 100% chance of not getting any common ground. So let's start with the idea that we can try and do something, and then go back, look at our Madisonian Republic. Look at how the Republic was designed, the Constitution by which we live. Look at the fact that James Madison and the other 50 or so delegates understood that there would be lots of conflict in our culture, and in our political culture in particular. And this is why he invented something that had never been seen on the face of the earth. You enlarge the Republic, and you welcome the diversity of factions and voices. You don't want a homogeneous culture or ethnic group. What you want is a diversity of the voices there, because that strengthens the Republic. Madison saw it. He solved the riddle of the Republic, which had plagued people since Carthage and Rome had fought each other back in the ancient world. He knew that the reality is that politics is about getting half a loaf, which is better than no loaf at all. It's about the politics of prudence. It's about learning how to compromise in a principled way to preserve, yes, your first principles. Compromising in a principled way to preserve your first principles, because you understand the hierarchy of your principles and what you've got to have when you go to the negotiating table and then when you conclude. Now, this leads to a lot of misunderstanding when I talk this way. I've been speaking to lots of people, and a lot of people just say to me, look, all this common ground business, you're just going to have people going to the stupid vanilla middle. They'll be in the center lane, and they're going to be roadkill. That's the metaphor that I often get. Or as Texas Senator Ted Cruz likes to say, all those people who are talking about common ground are squishes. They're squishes. They're not really going to get anything accomplished that's meaningful for the country. Well, as I like to say to Senator Cruz, this is not about the stupid vanilla middle, nor is it about turning Republicans into Democrats or Democrats into Republicans. It's about how do you take people who are fundamentally formed. They're already formed. They know what they believe. How do you take them and enable them through goodwill and certain techniques so that they can actually communicate with each other to move the country forward? Also, this is not about compromising for its own sake, just assuming that you always have to compromise. In fact, there are times when I think anybody in this room would agree, there are times not to compromise. There are times when in foreign policy debates or debates about justice for our own citizens, when you absolutely hold the line. And it's necessary to make that statement, that Sherman-esque statement, and not back down. To use just a couple of examples for you. When the Second Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia in 1775, 1776, and they reached out to the king with the olive branch petition, and what came back was a hostile response. That was a time not to compromise. That was a time when John Adams was able to rally really the people, even the people who are pretty reluctant, like John Dickinson, who did not want to go to war against the biggest empire on earth, understandably so. But there's a time where you don't live under a tyrant. Second example, Lincoln would not compromise with the South. He had first tried, but he realized when the Union itself was at stake, he waited patiently for Southerners to fire the first shot. And then he knew that a line in the sand had been drawn, and he was not going to compromise on two pressing issues that had not been resolved by the founders. One of them was slavery, and he wanted to make sure that issue was settled then and now. And the other issue, besides slavery, was sovereignty. Were we part of these United States, or were we Americans first who happened to be from Virginia, New York, Michigan, and so forth. He wanted there to be no question that we're Americans first. So that was a crucial watershed in our history. And then I think a little bit more sensitive topic, but it bears, I mean, the more and more I talk about this with people, the more they agree. Vietnam. We needed more debate in the early 60s. In 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, the first incident and then the so-called second incident, what if we had had more debate? What if we had had a tougher series of debates nationally instead of just going pell-mell into the Vietnam War, which turned out to be so tragic for so many? And I come from a military family in saying that. In the American system at its best, then there are times when people should not compromise. But for the most part, principled compromise is exactly how our system works. It's in Americans' DNA. We see it in the historic reality of places like the Second Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention, to which I've already referred. Now, the other question I often get, Gleaves, it sounds like you're saying that really, the only time we're going to get common ground is in a crisis. There's some existential crisis where the country is in danger of coming under war, the pressure of war, which could obliterate us or change us so drastically that we'd have to live under a different constitutional regime. Well, it's interesting. I did a little research in preparation for this talk about the surveys showing how Americans, both professional political scientists, historians, and citizens, have ranked the greatest legislation from Congress. And here is what I found. If you if you conflate the findings, this is what you find. The most significant legislation from Congress, according to the surveys, Civil Rights Act of 1964. That wasn't war. Second, the end of the importation of slaves, 1807. Third, the Social Security Act, 1935. Fourth, the Louisiana Purchase, 1803. Fifth, Interstate Highway Act of 1956. Sixth, the GI Bill, 1944, at the end of the war. Seventh, the Homestead Act of 1862. Eighth, the Fair Labor Standards Act, 1938. Ninth, the Missouri Compromise, 1820. And 10th, the Marshall Plan, 1848. Ladies and gentlemen, I could keep ticking off examples all the way down through 21 pieces of legislation in which no war, no existential crisis in terms of a foreign threat is accounted for. Then finally, with 22, the declaration of war against Japan is listed. Now, that suggests something to me. It suggests that Americans do have a temperament to try to seek common ground. As cynical as we are today, it suggests that we can learn from these examples through the teaching of history how principled compromise is done, and that we can learn that horse trading, I know it sounds like a horrible thing, but that horse trading actually preserves the first principles that people hold dear. We can learn from our hometown hero, Gerald R. Ford, how it's done, because remember, he had an idea in his rhetoric that was very important, influential. He never had enemies. He always called people with whom he disagreed opponents, but never enemies. We can teach the history and the effective techniques in the classroom, and we can also learn from some of the conservative and progressive icons. And don't just take it from me. What I'd like to do is just read a couple of things to you. I've brought along a copy of The Conservative Mind since I mentioned it, and I'm also, this is going to be obviously from the right, and then Paul Wellstone's Conscience of a Liberal is going to be on the left, obviously. But let me read you something that I think is a little bit disarming from Russell Kirk. From page 20, there's this. Listen to the language Dr. Kirk uses. Both the impulse to improve and the impulse to conserve are necessary to the healthy functioning of any society. Whether we join our energies to the party of progress or to the party of permanence must depend upon the circumstances of the time. That doesn't sound like an ideologue. He's saying there, obviously, that you need progressives. You need that healthy tension. And Russell is implying there, although I don't want to carry this too far, but he's implying there that there was maybe a time in American history where he would have put more of his energies into progressive measures. That is what is implied by that statement. He also said that the kinds of people we need in public office are men and women with a disposition to preserve and an ability to reform. Again, marrying the two ideas, conflating these, even, not just in the R camp over there and the D camp over there, but in one's person. Now let's look at what Senator Wellstone, who very, very liberal, very, very liberal member of the Senate, taught at Carleton College in Minnesota for a number of years before he represented that state in the Congress. He says something I think is just beautiful here on page 13 of The Conscience of a Liberal. He said, people yearn for a politics of the center, not the center so widely discussed by politicians and pundits in Washington, in other words, a political center, but rather a politics that comes from the center of people's lives. What a great way to look at the center. It comes from the center of our lives. And he also says, and this would be on page 205, 206, I believe. He said, clearly there is a forgotten American majority. The challenge is to make a place for these Americans at the decision-making table, to force our political leaders to listen to their concerns. Public policy is not just an academic exercise or a philosophical exercise about hypothetical problems. Public policy affects all of us, where we live and where we work. Well, I think there could be broad agreement. And we know, for example, through the cordial relations that a lot of progressives and conservatives have had with one another, that there was a time in this country when people could sit down and talk about their differences, even if it had to be over a good sip and scotch. It still could happen. I also like to make two other points when I talk about common ground. I teach history in the classroom, and sometimes I have students with a real ideological bent, and I'm always eager to point out to them, American history doesn't take place just over in the conservative camp. It doesn't just take place growing out of the progressive camp. It is the conflict, the compromises, the consensus building that happens between those two camps. That's really the ground of our history. You cannot understand American history if you're just going to look at it from one point of view or the other. And I add this, especially in our leadership academy. It is not leadership to run to your TV, your cable TV station, to learn what talking points you want to say today. So if you're a conservative and are running to Fox News, or if you're a liberal and running to MSNBC, you're really a follower. You're really somebody who's going to take the points that have been decided by the pundits and project those. Be a real leader. A real leader is building bridges between the two. A real leader is going to step away from the talking points and say, I have got to deal with somebody who probably has the support of 40% of the electorate. That's leadership, instead of running to our cocoon. Who knows, with that technique, maybe we can even get Wolverines to get along with Spartans. Well, I'd like to conclude. We send our children to war. Our neighbors lose their job in a recession. We know people who do not have adequate access to health care. And I really do think that citizens in our country want to do better. We know we can do better if we know the history of this country. The Hauenstein Center is going to emerge as a leader in the search for common ground. That is what my energies are dedicated to. We are going to combat cynicism. We're going to combat the hopeless, hapless, helpless attitude of so many people that it can never happen. And we are going to be reaching out and forming partnerships, and we're going to do 5 things, and I want to leave you with these 5 things. First of all, we're going to make Americans who come into our orbit aware of the historic reality of Common Ground through the programs we host and the speakers we have. Second, we're going to help people in our community achieve it. We're going to be training the trainers to do it. Third, we're going to provide an open, respectful forum where conservatives and progressives can revisit their tradition, redefine it if necessary, and address the challenges of the 21st century. And fourth, we're not stopping there. We're going to encourage others. We're going to fan out. I hope to encourage our colleagues in other colleges and universities to do the same, to develop their own Common Ground initiatives. And finally, fifth and finally, what I'd like to see is Grand Valley to host a clearinghouse of best practices. Why not have people come from other communities and colleges and universities to West Michigan and tell us their stories? This is how Common Ground actually worked in our community. And let's quit always, staying on the negative, and let's talk about this in a positive way. Think I'm naive? Maybe so. Think the effort really won't work? Laugh at me. Maybe so. But as I said earlier, as we say in Texas, I guarantee you it won't work if we don't try. So let me close by paraphrasing one of my heroes, Winston Churchill. Seeking common ground is the worst way a self-governing people can conduct their public affairs until all the other ways have been tried and found wanting. Thank you. Now, I'd like to do something a little different. Rather than just open this up for questions and answers, because I don't pretend to be look at the collective wisdom in this room. What I would like to do is invite you to come forward with a common ground story of your own that you know works. Maybe it's something you read about in a biography or a history. Maybe it's something you saw on the History Channel. Maybe it's something you experienced. Maybe it's something you were a part of. But I'd like for you to come forward and come to either one of the microphones. If you're representing the progressive side and you want to go over to the left-hand mic, that's fine. If you're representing the conservative side and want to be over there on the right-hand side, that's fine too. But I would very much like to hear some of your stories. I think it's important that the collective wisdom of this room be given a voice for this kind of initiative. And I see Representative Dahlman. Hi, Jesse. Thank you for joining us this evening.
I'm Representative Dahlman, retired. Common ground is possible, but it depends on the leaders at the top. And an example, for instance, when I was in the legislature, one election cycle, the outcome was tied. We had 55 Democrats, we had 55 Republicans. Well, how do you get the Speaker of the House? Who's going to be the Speaker? And so after a lot of discussion, they ironed that out, but then who's going to chair the committees? Is it going to be a Republican? Is it going to be a Democrat? Who's going to decide on the agenda? So they ended up, we had co-speakers. We had Curtis Hertel from the Democrats, who was from the Detroit area, and Paul Hilligans, who was from Allegan County, in the west side of the state. And in order to sort out the committees, we had co-chairmen for each committee. And what we did was 1 month, the Democrat would chair the committee, the next month, the Republican would. Now you'd probably say, oh my gosh, that's really confusing. And who's going to help you with that? Well, the staff is going to help you with that. And did we hire more staff? No. We did with what we had. And fortunately, Curtis and Paul were good friends. Both were moderates. Curtis was a moderate Democrat. Paul was a moderate Republican. I don't think they socialized. I don't think they went out like Reagan and Tip O'Neill used to do and have drinks together. but they honored each other as friends, and they were willing to work together, and they both had a pretty good sense of humor. But what's more important was nobody wanted to grab the power, and that's what we have today. Nobody said, "I won." They couldn't. That took the issue away. But we worked out, we got a lot done in 2 years. We were friends with the people on the other side of the aisle. We didn't socialize, but we have coffee together occasionally. And the women we had the women, Democrats and Republicans, we had a couple of dinners together, and it worked out very well. We got a lot done, and I think that was the best example of the years that I spent in the legislature, because nobody really, as I said, grabbed the power. They wanted to work on the issues, and we got a lot done. So that's my example of common ground.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you very much. Professor Jason Duncan.
Okay, thanks, Gleaves, for the work you're doing. Very important. John F. Kennedy, Democrat, early 60s. Back then, the parties were less ideological. It was moderates, Democratic Party, liberals, conservatives. Republicans were moderate, liberal, both. It's the height of the Cold War. So, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we come this close to the unthinkable. Kennedy and Khrushchev stepped back. And Kennedy and Khrushchev both looked to find common ground between the nations. So, they're starting the negotiations on a test ban treaty, the first arms control agreement of the Cold War. Now, this took some courage on both men's parts. As a Democrat, Kennedy had to be a little bit concerned that he might be accused of being soft in communism. And Khrushchev, for his part, had to be concerned he was soft in capitalism and not America. Okay, so they both had that. But the common ground that's more relevant for us is that when Kennedy sent a delegation of U.S. senators to Moscow, which is really unprecedented at this point. This is 1963. And he included Democrats and Republicans in the delegation. Charles Brown brought that to my attention when I was running my Kennedy book. He deserves the credit for that. But the thing was, Kennedy learned from history. He knew that Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, when he went to Paris to hammer out the League of Nations Treaty, he just brought Democrats. He wasn't interested in what the other side had to say. So Kennedy knew enough about history and was good enough at common ground to learn from that mistake. So both Republicans and Democrats got on that airplane. I forget the Republicans, maybe George Aiken of Vermont, a few others, and they helped oversee this treaty. It comes back to the Senate, and the Senate has a right to put it up or down. And there was still a lot of skepticism about the treaty, about the Soviets. Can we trust them? And there are people on both sides who weren't certain we could. Well, Kennedy, working with Republicans and Democrats, got the Senate to approve that treaty 80-19. Pretty good, because at first there was a lot of opposition to it. So common ground between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and more importantly, common ground between Democrats and Republicans, 1963.
Great example. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name's Gordy Aldrink. I'm on the faculty at Grand Valley.
Great.
I grew up in West Michigan. My dad is a Reformed Church minister, and I can't think of anything more, and I can say this because I grew up in this area. People might not like it, but I can't think of anything more that divides people than religion. We have Dutch Reformed, we have Reformed, we have Christian Reformed. We can go on down the line. My wife and I attend a gathering of people in Grand Haven, and this is a group of people that have transcended the ideologue of belief. We've set aside our beliefs and identified common values. And to me, I think that's that's going to be the key to common ground. Is you sort of mentioned first principles, and if what you mean by first principle are ideas, that still could put up roadblocks. I think, at least in our experience, setting aside first principles in terms of beliefs have allowed a group of people that are extremely diverse from a religious standpoint to make significant gains with the things that we do. So that's what I would like to propose, is that we consider the difference between beliefs and values and have some conversation about that.
Very good, thank you. Dr. Bill Anderson, colleague of mine from Lansing days.
Gleaves, you remember that we had the privilege of serving together on Michigan's Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. And you remember that we decided to advocate that we ought to use Lincoln's leadership as a basis for establishing common ground. And there is no other president in our history that is so strongly embraced by both parties. In fact, Republicans sometimes get all concerned because they think Democrats are trying to hijack Lincoln. And down through history, every president has sought to get right with Lincoln. And you remember we got funding from the Fetzer Foundation in Kalamazoo to sponsor the Lincoln Leadership Series for our legislators. And I visited with 30 legislators, 15 on both sides of the aisle, and proposing this. And everyone said, this is great. And I think that illustrates, one, what their real sentiments are when given the opportunity. Over and over they said, this is what we really need. We need to start thinking as Lincoln thought. And I can't think, and maybe you can't either, of any president that was able to bring together people of all persuasions in a leadership role and make a cohesive government out of it.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, Peter. Yes, Peter Turner. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the lessons that I've learned about common ground came from Theodore White. You remember he wrote that great series of books on the making of a president, starting with the Nixon-Kennedy campaign and went on for, 4 or 5 subsequent campaigns. And then at the end of his career, he wrote 2 books that were not making of the president. One was an autobiography, which was a great story. But the other one was what he felt he had learned from his experience of writing those books, The Making of the President. And, you know, it was a time when there was a lot of discussion and a lot of antipathy towards the smoke-filled room. And he said at the end of his book about what he had learned, he said one of the great regrets he had in what had happened in this country was the passing of the smoke-filled room. Because he said that's where people compromised. He said you got them in there and they found common ground, they compromised, and he said, you know, this was such a better way of doing it than these single issue people who come in and will not consider any other alternative. And that's a great lesson about common ground, I think.
So let's go back to the smoke-filled room. You are a bold man, Peter. Yes.
Hi, I'm Susan Bowers, and mine is a more provincial or regional common ground. I was born and raised in the South, and for all of my life, I only knew of anybody above the Mason-Dixon line as being a Yankee carpetbagger. The Civil War, if you've ever lived in the South, the Civil War is still being fought in this day, and truly it is. When I married years ago, my late husband, who was not only a Catholic, Irish, Republican, but Yankee, there could not have been a worse fate. And there was no common ground. Susan, how can you do this? We have nothing in common. This is an alien. And through the years, I mean, they had never known a Yankee They had never learned anything about philosophy or religion or lifestyles or what have you. But through the years of my being a Southerner, married to it, as they called him lovingly, a damn Yankee, there was common ground that was found in appreciating each other's lifestyles. And it was, I mean, to this day, they're still looking for common ground because the Southerners will never forgive the Yankees for what they did. But nonetheless, they're coming to understand that life does exist outside of the South and above the Mason-Dixon line, and there can be happiness and acceptance of each other's lifestyles, values, philosophies.
Common ground in the family. That's where it starts. Thank you, Susan. Any other stories that you'd like to give us a little wisdom by before we adjourn tonight? Well, I want to thank you. Oh, yes, please, Bob.
That last comment made me think that there are many of us in the room who've been happily married for 47 years who know all about common ground.
Hear, hear.
But many of us, too, I think, are quite worried about the developments in Syria and the game of challenging each other, Russians, Americans, Syrians, and Saudi Arabians, and the rest of it, and the terrible consequences that could result from the kind of bombing. And I found myself wondering if we haven't witnessed some common ground this morning, as rather than having to bomb anyone and rather than forcing Russians to somehow defend their Syrian partners, Kerry this morning came up with, well, you know, we could settle this whole thing if they would just put their chemical weapons into international control. We don't have to bomb them and kill innocent citizens. And within minutes, the Russian ambassador said, we are urging the Syrians to do that. And what a simple solution to a terribly conflictive, dangerous situation. But I think it's all about common ground, and I hope it develops and continues, and that's the solution. But common ground can work, can't it?
I think so. Well, thank you for some great stories. You know, it's really been a privilege to lay this idea out for you. We have great hopes for this idea. Appreciate your coming and giving us a good listen. Appreciate your sharing your stories with us. We want this to go forward. And again, Ralph, thank you so much for all of the support you've given along the way. We couldn't do any of this without you. But there are many people in this room who also have been very supportive of the Hauenstein Center in general and Common Ground in particular, and Grand Valley supporters, Great Lakers to boot. So I want to thank you. It's been a great evening from our perspective. And please come to our events this year where we'll get to explore common ground. Thank you.